Is the headline for this. So welcome everybody to the meeting. It is of course being webcast. With us we also have Dina Romero and Andy Waite, the chairs of Children, Adults, Health and Wellbeing, Scrutiny and Climate Emergency and Sustainability. They're here to take part in the discussion on the budget and report from the findings and the discussion that took place at their panels. But first of all, it's the emergency evacuation procedure.
When the continuous alarm bell sounds, you must evacuate the building by one of the designated exits and proceed to the named assembly point. The designated exits are signposted. Arrangements are in place for the safe evacuation of disabled people.
Thank you very much. Do we have any apologies for absence or any substitutions? No, have full house. Declarations of interest.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a declaration of interest, just for noting in the minutes, really, that as a Cabinet Project Lead for the areas of the Transport Improvement Programme and Highways Maintenance, I don't have any decision-making powers in this role, but I have been involved in conversations about these budgets, and for reasons of transparency, I will not be contributing to the debate in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. Ollie.
Yes, in a similar way to Lucy, Chair, I also am a Cabinet Project Lead on supporting on the area of climate and ecological emergency, so I also won't be commenting on that area of the budget. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. And as is usual practice, if anything comes up in the discussions that any member of panel thinks is a conflict of interest, please just say at that point in time and we'll make sure that's noted. Moving on to agenda item 5, I've got no urgent business, or no urgent business has been notified to me. So we come on to public and councillor statements. First of all, Sean Hughes.
Okay, thank you. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is the proposal for parking charges in Midsummer Norton car park. As you know, we've previously had issues where the council have tried to sell the car park to a supermarket, proposals to build houses on it. We had parking charges version 1, and now we're on to parking charges version 2. Every time we've established that this car park is key to a very fragile economy, and a lot of businesses are likely to fail without this free car park. So looking at the two main reasons this seems to be proposed, the first is a claim that our high street is comparable with Keynsham and therefore should incur the same sort of parking charges. Well, quite frankly, that's ridiculous. I mean, if we take the last decade, for example, in Keynsham they've had £28,000 spent on a civic centre. They had millions spent on developing a council building into 96 apartments. They've had a fortune spent on the redevelopment of the high streets and the new layout of the high streets. By comparison, Midsummer Norton has had nothing and has been completely neglected. And Bath again, I mean, Bath has had £10 million on security barriers, £7 million on an old post office, more than £2 million spent on just on feasibility studies for the Milsom Quarter. And again, Midsummer Norton, as I say, it's just been completely neglected. So, in summary, tens of millions of pounds have been spent on Bath and Keynsham to improve the footfall, the shopping experience, and Midsummer Norton has been completely left behind in this. So you cannot compare Bath, Keynsham and Midsummer Norton. The second justification for the car parking charges is to save us all from the emissions. Now, first of all, we don't have an issue with our air quality in Midsummer Norton in the High Street. But this proposal to introduce emissions-based charges just basically puts a burden on the poorest in our community. Those that can afford the latest electric cars or the most fuel-efficient cars will pay the least. Our poorest residents that need a car, whether they like it or not, will be the one that get punished by this method of calculation. In our area, cars are not generally a luxury. They're a necessity. Our residents need them to access the high street for things like banks, pharmacies, libraries, council services, professional services, and of course support the shops. I did hear at the last scrutiny panel I was at that I'll just make this last point if that's okay. There was a proposal by Councillor Rigby and Councillor Alton that perhaps they could look at restricting the parking, have free parking for 2 hours. Quite frankly, I don't see how that will work, because if the majority of people only park for 2 hours or less, then there won't be any revenue. So I think I've made my point there, that the cost of installing the equipment and the enforcement will outweigh any benefits you would get. So I know you want me to bring this to a close, so I'd ask you to revisit this idea of parking charges. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Are there any factual questions from panel members? If not, Colin.
Just a quick one, Sean. Just about Love Your High Street investment. I appreciate that the lack of investment is very obvious, but the Love Your High Street process, the WECA money that was around, I know a lot of that went in administration charges. Can you just maybe just give us a bit of detail on how that's affected the High Street?
Yeah, so there was a very limited investment which was funded by English Heritage and WECA, but it was very limited to a heritage fund. It was purely to redevelop the market square back into a market square. There was some limited funding towards the town hall, but to be honest, that was my opinion on that is that, I mean, Baines played a blinder on that. Rather than invest in our town, they gave back the town hall, which required a huge amount of work to make it workable, and the town council, as a consequence, have had to take out 50-year loans to cover the costs. So there's been no investment from Baines at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Ian. Factual question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. You've expressed a concern that were 2-hour free parking be available, the actual cost of implementing the parking machines and the enforcement would be exorbitant to the council. Is there evidence to suggest that people do actually use that car park for more than 2 hours? So are we seeing people staying there for over spending half the day there, for example?
Well, there's very little evidence at all, because no feasibility studies or exercises have been done. There's been no impact assessments. There's been no work at all, apart from standing Michael Alton in the car park for an hour to ask the opinions of residents. But we know that if you were to start off with this 2 hours free parking, it would disappear very quickly, purely on financial grounds, because you wouldn't generate the £200,000 that you've put in your budget.
I suppose following on, I've got a factual question as well then. As this proposal is about raising money, and this proposal is about collecting money, living as I do in Radstock and representing Westfield, similar to yourself in Midsummer Norton, when was the last time you saw a parking enforcement officer around your way?
I think we see them on average once every 3 to 6 months. They might pop over for the day when the weather's nice.
I knew you were spoilt in Midsummer Norton. We don't see them that often, but thank you for that, Sean.
Thank you. Thank you.
And next, Becky Brooks, from Director of 3SG. You've got 3 minutes, but as I was extremely generous with Sean, and I don't want it to be seen that councillors get preferential treatment, don't be overly scared by the red light coming on. Good to see you, Becky.
Thank you, Robin. Good afternoon, everyone. As Robin said, I'm Becky Brooks. I'm the Director for 3SG. We are Bath and North East Somerset third sector group, and we support charities, social enterprise and community groups across Baines. As the infrastructure organisation supporting and advocating for the third sector in Baines, 3SG is extremely concerned about the proposed savings to the budget for both children's services and adult community contracts. We were disappointed with the timing of the consultation period being held over Christmas and New Year. This meant a loss of vital days of which organisations had to galvanise themselves and respond in a measured and appropriate way. The details of the required savings provided by the Council have been limited and has left the sector feeling insecure and vulnerable with a lack of certainty around future provision. Third sector organisations across Spain support tens of thousands of the most vulnerable people and employ thousands of staff, many of whom are local citizens contributing to the local ecosystem. This is now at risk. It is a challenge for the sector to make any meaningful plans for this next financial year, and organisations do not know whether they can continue to provide essential services and whether they are able to commit to employing staff. The wider impact of these savings on sector partners such as primary care and mental health trusts cannot be overestimated. Service providers who currently rely on an end-to-end care and support pathway in order to support people to stay healthy and well and live their best lives in their community. The core values of the Council and the ICB, focusing on the wider determinants of health and early intervention prevention, will be significantly undermined by this proposal if we lose these vital services. Third sector in Baines employs skilled, dedicated individuals who provide essential, cost-effective community provision which supports statutory services. We are not all about volunteering and making tea. Without us, these systems will fall down. They are already under extreme pressure. The sector is continually asked, and has been asked, to do more for less for an unsustainable period of time. One of the challenges is the many years of zero or significantly below inflation contract uplifts, resulting in significant real terms cuts in funding. This lack of inflationary uplift is not something our statutory partners will be able to sustain. And with both the cost of living and need rising, it is essential that the third sector is invested in, and so easing pressure on local authorities, on primary care and emergency services. The third sector is in a unique position with the ability to assess a range of external funding streams. However, we cannot rely solely on these funding sources in order to meet an ever-increasing funding shortfall. These are in limited supply with greater demand and cannot be guaranteed. We are fully aware of the financial challenges the Council face. However, we implore decision makers to provide more information on these proposals and to actively involve the sector in such decisions. Third sector partners need to be at the table rather than have decisions made for them. The sector knows its services and can work with Council colleagues to develop creative solutions which will ensure minimum disruption, remove service duplication, reduce the risk of job losses and the potential loss of services, which will ultimately increase the Council and statutory sector's costs. The third sector stepped in to support the Council in ways that it could not during the pandemic. These cuts should not be the thanks that it gets. It is time to be brave and think creatively to ensure Baines has a strong third sector for years to come.
Thank you very much. Dead on 3 minutes. Any factual questions? Ollie.
Thank you very much, Becky. Could you give us an idea of how many groups are affected or that you see could be affected from this and approximately how many people are employed by them?
We're not yet sure about the extent of the cuts. We've been asking for a breakdown of the 800 plus thousand that are proposed. We would really like to see that detail because in doing so we would be able to work with the Council to work out the best way. We know that you have to make cuts, but we think that these cuts are particularly disproportionate. We worked out that community services contracts is about 21%, and across the board in the average department savings it's about 5%. So we're asking for this to be measured out.
Thank you for that, Ollie. Thank you, Becky. Any other? Colin.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Becky. Thank you. yeah, for an organisation with so many vested interests in mental well-being, I can understand the fear factor going around at the moment is pretty tough to deal with. Inflationary uplift, and obviously the pressures that has already impacted. What historically have been the reasons given to you for that lack of inflationary and how you've had to work around it?
I'd have to ask, because we're not providers ourselves, I'd have to go out to members to find that out. But I do know that we have, so 3SG has nearly 230 members. I've been canvassing some of them, and I know that the general answer is, through most organisations, that they've had no uplifts in contracts, generally anywhere between 7 and 15 years. That's a long time for organisations to be trying to be creative and finding new ways of funding and bridging those gaps in funding, plugging those gaps, and all the while the need is rising and the money is getting less and less. So I think there's a real need to be creative about the way in which we deliver services, but we're asking for that to be on both sides.
Yes, Colin.
Just supplementary. So you at no point have been asked to give any input into an understanding of savings, because I can tell you've got no detail on this at all, but were you not asked to give any input?
No, none at all.
Thank you. Any other supplementaries? Factual questions? If not for myself, I think it's already been answered, Becky. 2 questions. First of all, what details have you had of where this 800,000 is coming from? And I'm assuming this is none at all. So can I assume as well then that you haven't been able to calculate what leverage that 800,000 brings in from other trusts, charities and the rest?
Yeah, that's correct. I think
Okay.
we when we were looking at the savings that could be made across other departments, and we know that adult social care is obviously the main concern and is costing the most. For leaving that alone, we were asking that if you were to look at the other 10 departments, you would need to find £60,000 across those 10 departments, which, given the money that we're talking about, doesn't seem like a lot of cash. But to the sector as a whole, this would make a huge difference.
Thank you very much for that presentation and for that information. And I know that this is an issue that's been taken up on a number of panels and will be taken up at Cabinet and at full council. And certainly from myself, and I'm sure that many other panel members, we really value the work that the third sector does, and we don't underestimate just how important it is and the money that it brings into Bath and North East Somerset. So thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for listening. It's causing a huge amount of anxiety, so we'd really welcome the opportunity to get round the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is statements and questions. I know that there's a question received from Councillor Ellen Jackson, who said she was going to be here to make a statement as well. But let's move on from that. And also, I think a question from Becky Brooks as well that came in. So then, moving on to agenda item 7. The minutes of both January meetings, both this and last week, will come to the March meeting of panel. Is that okay? And then we move on to the main agenda item, which is the budget and council tax 24-25 and financial outlook. First of all, can I ask Dina and Andy to join us as panel chairs, and welcome Mark, welcome Andy, and I'm sure you're very happy to be here.
Delighted as always.
Yes. So over to you. Please can you make the presentation prior to question and discussion?
Sure, so I'm going to start and then hand over to Andy to pick up anything that I've missed, and I'm sure I will. But people are, I'm sure, going to be bored of me saying it, but this has been a really, really difficult budget setting round. The cost of living crisis, which we've all been experiencing in our own personal budgets, equally affects the council, with costs rising dramatically. But with the council, we have the added huge increase in demand in social services, way, way beyond any standard level of inflation. Despite all that, I am pleased to be able to present to the panel a robust, balanced budget proposal unlike a number of local councils you'll have heard of in the news. The panel saw the medium-term financial strategy in the autumn, which set out the approach to delivering a balanced budget in this challenging context. And the report that you have in front of you is the result of that process. It's been through a rigorous assurance process with both internal and external independent challenge to make sure that the proposals are robust. The updated plan shows a balanced budget for 24-25 and 25-26 with a gap from 26-27 onwards, but we expect this to reduce to a balanced position once income growth and further efficiencies have been factored in. The report includes estimates for future pay awards, pension costs, council tax and business rate income, government grant income and inflation. Recognising the risk in the budget process, we've included a contingency of £3 million in general budget risk and a further £1 million for inflation pressure on contracts that's unbudgeted for in the coming year. I'm sure panel members don't need this, but for the sake of any members of the public watching who are unfamiliar with the budget process, I'd like to reiterate the point that the council budget is very clearly divided into revenue, our spending on day-to-day operational things, ongoing services we provide to the public, and capital, one-off spending on assets, buildings, roads, etc. When councils talk about financial difficulty, it's the revenue budget they're talking about. An out-of-control capital, not that ours is in any way out of control, I hasten to add, but an out-of-control capital budget can impact the revenue budget because things like borrowing costs or capital losses have to then be represented as ongoing costs in the revenue side of the budget. This is usually characterised in the news reports as councils making bad investments. But in general, these are two very separate budgets. As the panel will remember, when we reported back in the autumn, we were looking at a revenue funding gap of 16.82 million. The budget proposal meets that gap through 6.51 million of income generation and £10.3 million of savings and cost reductions. And again, you've got more details of those numbers in Annex 1. I want to state at this point that I've heard what the third sector providers have been saying in both this meeting and in the other PDS panels, and I will be taking that away and considering what we can do to help with that. Of course, to balance the budget will require the maximum raising of council tax and adult social care precept to 4.99%. It doesn't seem likely that any council in the country will be doing anything other than that. And the government expects all councils to do that when they calculate what they call our core spending power. They're assuming a maximum rise in council tax. I don't want this all to be doom and gloom. We have considered new growth requests that help the council meet its corporate strategy, which is set out in the Funding Growth Annex, and should note that, to the panel that this adds new spending to children's services budget by nearly 6.9 million and the adult services budget by over 4.6 million. So it's not like we're cutting those services, we are adding money. Even after taking the savings in those departments into account, the net growth in those two departments is 5.6 million and 2.3 million respectively. So we are plowing considerable extra cash into these vital services. We've also found room in the capital programme for significantly increased spending on transport and highways improvements, alongside making allocations for our social housing delivery programme, which is an absolutely key commitment for this administration, and funds for developing the Fashion Museum, which will become a significant asset for the council. Importantly, we've also set aside funds to developing in-area special educational needs and disability facilities, which will greatly help with our revenue budget in future years and provide a better service for those service users, stopping us having to send children outside the area for provision that they desperately need. So I'm very pleased to be presenting to you a robust, balanced budget proposal. I look forward to your comments and discussions. And with that, I'll hand over to Andy to pick up anything I've missed.
Thanks, Mark. So I'll just say a few words and just echo Mark's comments about saying how challenging this budget's been. It's one of the most difficult ones that I've worked on. I think that is really in recognition of the inflation impacts that touch on almost every aspect of council spending, and we do have to recognise that when we look forwards around setting our cost requirement in terms of the council's base budget. A few headlines and things to just touch on that will add to what Mark's already covered. I think in terms of the last conversation I had with the panel, we're awaiting the settlement from government departments. So our assessment figures came in December. We weren't better off than our assumptions. We're actually worse off. There's adjustments to a number of government grants, but the actual impact was a net 187k worse off. So it wasn't a kind of good news Christmas settlement for us. Fortunately, that didn't involve us looking for further savings. At the same time, we were refreshing our council tax base, and there was some growth in the tax base that helped mitigate that. So that meant no further cuts required on top of the 16.8 savings we'd already identified. So that was, at least some positive to take away. So just to kind of go through the numbers again, what the proposal being put forward to Cabinet and Council shows is a fully balanced budget for the next 2 years, with 16.82 million savings required next year, and the following year is 6.57 million savings. So the level of savings is really in balance to the growth requirement for next year. It's £25 million of growth. That's recognising the higher cost of pay award and also contract inflation. Putting those two together is around 10 million. When we look at current risks and pressures across council services, we've got overspending in areas like children's services, which is higher demand and higher cost. That's recognised and built into the budget for next year. So there is rebasing in the budget. But on top of that, predicting future cost as well in those services. So there's demographic growth and budget rebasing of around 14 million. So you can start seeing how quickly the numbers start getting pretty big when you start thinking about the different components where costs can increase. Core assumptions on pay are 5% for next year. Council tax is at the referendum limit, so 4.99%. That's 2.99 on general council tax and 2% for the social care precept. We have modelled the higher cost of interest in terms of council borrowing, but also looking at CPI rates, a sensible rate on inflation, contract inflation for next year as well. So we're modelling at around 5%. It does go up and down in a couple of specific areas, but that's generally the amounts we're modelling at for next year. I think that covers probably most of the key points around the revenue budget. Just a note in terms of the capital annex you have in the pack also, there is new capital going in for key schemes addressing the housing shortage in the region. So there's budget going in for social housing delivery on key sites across the region, also investment in transport, and also linked to the council's safety valve programme with the Department for Education. There's SEND provision that's being budgeted for in capital that will help address the capacity issues we have in the region. Probably just the final thing for me to close off on. When I do the budget proposal and work with colleagues in the Cabinet on this, I do an independent assessment. It's called the Section 25 statement that's part of the Local Government Act. It's where I look at the overall budget proposal and also do an assessment on our level of reserves that we hold as a council. So this assessment looks at future risk that could crystallise, and then we do an assessment on our reserve levels we hold. I'm not proposing a significant change to general reserve. There are some risks that have been removed, but there are also new risks that have been brought into that. What that's identified is a risk range of between 12.3 million and 13.6 million in terms of risk kind of tolerance, and our reserve levels for general unearmarked is 12.58 million, so that's within that range. So I think that's probably some of the key things I wanted to touch on. Yeah, that's covered it. So back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that. As you say, very difficult circumstances, and I think the context you give of announcements from government which made things worse, not only for us, but for a lot of other councils as well. I think it's worth as well mentioning that the context, just being north of Somerset, who are possible facing bankruptcy, and all reports being that 1 in 5 councils are bankruptcy in the broadest term one in 5 councils are facing that level of financial risk, but fortunately not ourselves. So hopefully the discussion should be in that context. And speaking personally, of course, let's hope that this is the last budget discussion we have with this current Conservative government in post giving us money. But, oh, sorry, I'm not allowed to say that, so I won't. So, moving quickly on, next I'm going to ask Dina and Andy to make statements on behalf of their panels. I know that Councillor Romero has to go shortly, but across to you, Dina, for your panel statement.
Thank you very much, Robin. I just want to first of all just take a tiny issue, and it's just about wording, because there's this sense, I think, sometimes from what is said, that actually there's that different outcomes could be achieved, and I'm just talking particularly about the overspend in children's services. As far as I'm aware, this is not it's not a consequence of mismanagement. It is actually that increase in demand. It is about higher costs. So I just wondered, if it was possible, maybe different words could be applied. But going back to the report from our scrutiny panel, and I'm going to be echoing some of the words that Becky also spoke of, because there were a number of issues that were raised both by our speakers and also by our panel members as well around the lack of detail in the budget. So we it's all very well saying yes, we could make a saving across this headline, but we don't know what that headline covers, and that also applies obviously to our various partners as well. There were concerns raised around the savings targets, but I know that, as Becky herself has shared, everybody understands why we are where we are, but it's the impact, I think, that was particularly felt, and the lack of clarity about when these cuts would come into play, and, how then could some of that vital preventative work that isn't statutory but is so important in order that we can deliver timely services to people, there was that lack of clarity about the timeliness and timings and exactly what was being asked, particularly that sense of are our voluntary sector at a cliff edge? And obviously that would lead to some of that anxiety that was mentioned earlier as well. So I'm anxious not to spend too long repeating what has already been said, but I would urge the Cabinet member to reconsider the cuts that are being put forward, and as that I know will be extremely challenging, at least to work with the voluntary sector, both for children and adult service providers, and find ways of smoothing the targets and to really explore those timescales for the savings. But also, always remember that our voluntary sector, 3SG, and other partners are often providing those preventative services, which means that those people are then not at a crisis point later on, which is undoubtedly much more costly for us as a council, but also for other service providers as well.
Thank you, Gina. Andy.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to start off by saying that I sympathise with Mark's position. I've been a councillor at the start of my second term, and throughout the whole of that term, we have found ourselves in a difficult position because of the unfair treatment of central government towards local government. I'm not going to make a political speech, although I'm extremely tempted to, but I'll just leave it there.
Please feel free.
Well, that's tempting. But simply, it would be nice if the local authorities' services were appreciated by central government rather than using excuses like, well, they're not very efficient, are they? And, you know, there's sort of vanity projects, etc., etc. And I have had the thought that after the post office scandal, where the government tended to do the same thing, which was blame the little man, I hope you don't mind, Chair, me suggesting that Baines Council is a little man, but we certainly punch above our weight in the amount of services we offer. And I don't, as I said at the start, I don't envy Mark's position in trying to balance what is almost impossible to balance, particularly as the services that we have to provide are massively overwhelming in compared to the other bits. And of course I represent the other bits. And the bits I represent are the climate emergency bits. And I think most of us around this table and in this room would suggest that the climate emergency was a massively important thing, but is extremely difficult to have a sensible approach to it if there is no infrastructure to look at the work. And over the first period of my term, a lot of money was put into the budget to allow people to look at ways in which we can improve our climate emergency status. And we now have a very efficient and very small team working hard to look at ways of working with the community, often, incidentally, with the voluntary sector, in order that we can actually make a difference. And our policies have been driven quite a lot by the climate emergency. We've only got to look at the issues in Bath, or the clean air zone and livable neighbourhoods, and all those sort of things. And some of them are quite controversial and not always 100% popular, but we are beginning to deliver evidence that we are closing down on some of our pollutions. And so the only issue from the meeting, because we don't really have significant cuts in the climate emergency part of the budget, simply because there isn't very much there anyway. And the only real issue that came from the meeting we had on the budget were the issues that Sean has already raised to do with the evidence in Midsummer Norton and the parking charges. I'm sympathetic to some extent because as a Keynesian councillor I would have been saying exactly the same things about 15 years ago when they introduced it into Keynesian. But we are where we are, and I think difficult decisions have to be made. And so I would like to congratulate the workings of the climate emergency people and the work that they've done, particularly Sarah Warren, who has had to grapple with all sorts of interesting people in order to achieve what she's done so far. So we are in a different position, I think, from most parts of the budget, in the sense that we're such a small seedling which is growing, and thank you for not cutting us off at our roots. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Dina. I will obviously be speaking to Cabinet and to full Council on behalf of this panel, and I see my role as passporting your comments rather than interpreting them. So I'm sure over the next few days we'll work out the form of words that you agree with. But thank you for those for that report, those reports back from scrutiny panels. So up to panel members. Do we have any questions? Who wants to be first with questions and comments? And it's Ian.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's just really a case that the Council has got to make a decision 29th of February, or sorry, no, 20th of February to actually formalise their budget for the next years. Just based on what's been discussed, I'm not going to ask for like confirmation or confidence, but can we just be very certain for the purposes of the public that we're definitely, as a council, never going to be in a Section 114 situation. We're not going to be in the likes of Thurrock or Birmingham or Woking.
We are definitely not in that position.
That's very good of you to say and to be so confident about it. We, last full council, also changed the format for offering council tax relief. Obviously, that's going to be coming in reasonably soon. Again, based on previous discussions, we are going to see likely that full pre-referendum maximum increase in council tax. And that's not to say also that I know that the Charter Trustees are going to be adding another 50 pence on their council tax, and also the precinct for Avon and Somerset, and the fire service is going to increase likely as well. We are in a position where we are going to be able to offer that relief and that support, or signpost those people who are going to be, as we realise, we're going to be disadvantaged by the changes to the relief system. That's still going to be able to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I was extremely pleased to be able to pass that adjustment to the council tax support scheme at the full council meeting. I think it's a much improved scheme, and I think it will help the most vulnerable and the most needy. Very, very pleased to be able to maintain that scheme.
Okay, and one final point, if I may. So regarding the third sector, there is an undertaking. We've got 3 more weeks at least to sort of agree finally the settlement. You're definitely pointing out that we're not cutting. We are actually going to divest monies from one source elsewhere to another. So can we have an undertaking that you will be sitting down with the third sector to discuss how to make things easier for them in delivery of the non-statutory services that the council provides?
Yeah, I'm very happy to confirm that we want to engage with the third sector in order to work with them, not do to them. I think it's, I hear everything that's said. We are in a position where we are going to have to make some financial savings. We do not want to be wielding a machete. We want to be wielding a scalpel. It's really important that we work with our partners and carry those partners with us. The work they do is extremely valuable. As they were saying, actually a lot of these contracts haven't been looked at for 10 or 15 years. So I think it's entirely reasonable for us to sit down with them and work out where things can be improved, where things can be, and to confirm where things are providing value for money. We are not in the business of shooting ourselves in the foot. If there are contracts that are shown to be providing value for money because they are saving us money downstream, because they are stopping people going into statutory services which cost more, then we absolutely should not be cutting those services. It would be stupid to do so. So I am very happy to confirm that we will work with the third sector. It's really unfortunate. I am sorry that it's come to them so late and came as a shock to them. The reality is that working through this budget process, we found ourselves in a position quite late on in the process where we were just still having to look for savings, and we were trying to protect this area. So it's not something we wanted to do particularly. It is something that's necessary. We will work with our partners to do it. And I will definitely take those things away and see what we can do to make that work as smoothly as possible.
Thank you for that. Any other? Who's next? Yep. Hal?
Looking at the budget, the figure that sticks out is the 16.82 million. That is a very large number, and I just wondered if you just want to comment on a couple of large elements in there, and also highlight any services that you think are going to be lost as a part of making that, and indicate how confident you are that you will be able to make those savings.
Okay, I'll take those in reverse order if you don't mind. Confidence-wise, I say we've been through a strong challenge process on this budget internally. I'm pretty confident that we've got a robust set of savings there, and we will be monitoring those very closely and carefully. We also have a general budget mitigation, risk mitigation reserve, as I said in my presentation at the start. So we do have some room to manoeuvre if we have been overly optimistic on any of these items. But there is some space there. I'd also point out that this isn't just savings, it's also income generation. I mean, there's 6 million quid's worth of income generation in here. So the 16 million isn't all savings. And I would highlight things like the Roman baths, which are going great guns. And so the income from heritage services is really helping here. Things would be much worse had we not got the increased income from heritage services and from parking revenue, and all of that stuff really helps. And it really helps us in providing vital statutory services around social care. Does that answer your question? I can't remember whether there's another one.
I think that's one other one, and this may be my misunderstanding, but if you look at the business rates retention, is it true that we are certain that we're going to get those numbers in future years? This comes from, I think, some confusion I might have had between business rate relief and business rate retention.
Okay. I'll pass over to Andy in a second, but my understanding is that at the moment we're part of what is badly labelled the 100% business rates retention scheme. That doesn't actually mean that we hang on to 100% of business rates for reasons that I believe to be historic, and I don't really understand how it got labelled as that. But we do keep about 20 million of the 60 million in business rates we raise, something along those lines. But that scheme is due to end in a few years' time. On the MTFS, we've taken that assumption that it ends in at some point, have we? Or, yeah. I'll pass over to Andy to comment on that.
Yeah, we've assumed for the 24-25 budget, which is correct because it's been confirmed as settlement, we remain in the scheme, but in future years there's a question mark. There's a whole business rate system review that needs to happen before any change is made. So until that review concludes and assesses how business rates are going to flow between councils and government, it's hard to give an exact answer because it's subject to the business rates review happening. But as Councillor Elliott said, whilst we're in the scheme, what we keep is where we generate business rates above a limit that's set by government. So we keep what we generate above a limit, but we make a tariff payment back to government. So the majority does go back to a government payment.
Dina.
Thank you. I just want to say I welcomed Mark's words around working with the voluntary sector, particularly around recognising the value of preventative services. But I just wanted to ask for some confirmation around how sort of the timings, just to give some sort of assurance, I think, to the voluntary sector about, how the assessment of that value is, how long that assessment is going to take, because I think in order to do it in a meaningful way, that it seems to me that should be a significant period of time to get to, the bottom line on the value. And I assume then, from what you said, you would also be working with the voluntary sector then on timings of savings once you've had that assessment piece.
So I definitely hear what is being said about avoiding a cliff edge. I think it's very difficult to, timing-wise, it's going to depend on the contract. We're talking about a lot of contracts of very varying different sizes. So, and they have different end dates, and but I think what I can guarantee is a reasonable approach that doesn't produce a cliff edge where we just immediately cut off everything. and we will work with the sector. One of the issues here is that a lot of these contracts have been run by HCRG. They've been outsourced, so actually we haven't been controlling them. So we absolutely acknowledge that one of the things we need to do is talk to the third sector about what these contracts are and what they involve, because we haven't been running them, and we are bringing them back in-house now. So, yeah, I can't give you a definitive answer. We need to work with the third sector to work out exactly what that pacing looks like. We will have to make savings. I say, I need to keep coming back to, we will have to make savings. There isn't a scenario where we can just, ignore the financial situation and not make savings. But we will work with them to phase that at in a sensible way that means that they don't get a cliff edge.
Thank you. I've got every panel member indicating to speak. So in order, I've got Ollie, then Onka, Colin, Malcolm, Lucy, Toby, then myself. So if anyone feels they're left out. Ollie.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think you partly addressed it, Mark, in your last remarks there, but about staying on the subject of the voluntary sector and delivery of these adult services, you mentioned that an element of what's being discussed here is bringing back the main adult services in-house. So do you see scope for, when that redesign happens, to actually maintain the relationships that exist with the voluntary sector, and how can we potentially strengthen those as that redesign happens? And maybe that's for the medium term, but it'd be interesting to understand that. I have one other question, if I may. Second one is around I think Andy mentioned that there's a certain estimate around the inflationary pressures that we see in this budget, and do you think that might need to be revisited at all in the coming months, and would that give a bit more headroom in the future?
Okay. I mean, in truth, the detail of the working with the third sector groups really should be addressed to the Cabinet members responsible for those areas, but I would absolutely assume that we will be wanting to work as closely as possible with those third sector organisations. They provide great services. So my assumption is that will happen. With regard to the inflation, I might hand over to Andy.
I would like to see some kind of upside in the inflation conversation in terms of our contract rates. I think what would happen in reality is I don't think costs are ever going to go down. So do costs increase more than what they are now, and more than 5% or less than 5%? I think that's the kind of million-dollar question for any business planning. So we've just got to be really prudent in what we put forward in the budget and reflect on what we know about prior year's costs and what we're experiencing on demand and inflation, because the CPI figures you kind of read through the ONS, whilst the reality is quite a lot of inflation is actually a lot higher than that in terms of those commercial negotiations with providers because of supply shortages and a number of other things. So the level we set it at, I think, is it's about right. I'm not sure there's going to be headroom in the budget next year, but if there is, that's something that we would review in year through our budget monitoring and enable us to make choices and decisions if there are other areas in terms of our savings delivery that we could almost like slow down a little bit, but that would be an in-year decision that the finance team would report to the Cabinet through our monitoring cycle.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I got two questions. So the first one, obviously this budgeting process is quite challenging, but the areas where budget shortfall is most pronounced, especially our social care, how you see, like, how likely or quickly they will see ease in funding after all these strategies or revenue generation going down the years? So that's my first question, if you want to answer that one.
I mean, I think there are things that we are doing, as I say, to try and mitigate the spend, the increase in spend in things like children's services, where we're trying to build in-area provision, which will be less costly than sending children out of area, and will reduce pressure on things like home-to-school transport, where we're having to send kids to facilities that are outside the Baines area, and that's obviously can be quite expensive. I mean, we have a statutory duty to transport, where we place children out of area, we then have a statutory duty to get those children to and from those facilities. So, and that, the costs for that are escalated massively. So the more provision we can bring back inside our own control, inside our own area, the better. And that's something that we're looking at. I mean, yeah. So I would say, I mean, the inflationary pressures can't carry on like this forever because they are enormous. So it has to slow down. But apart from just the natural slowing down of things because of the cycle, I think that we are doing things that are helping us as well to reduce the cost pressure.
Thank you. And my second question, are there any potential source of additional revenue in coming years? Like, obviously, at this current stage, you already exhaust probably all the options. But in coming year, can you see anything like in terms of additional revenue growth and help with the cost cutting?
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that one of the things that we have been focusing on around culture change in the council is a more should we say entrepreneurial attitude to looking at services and things we can provide. So I mean I think that's a general move, and then you've also got some of the bigger investments in things like Bath Quays and the Fashion Museum. I mean, you know, things like that in time will become significant income streams.
Thank you.
Thank you. Colin.
Thank you, Chair. Absolutely don't underestimate the mammoth task you guys have had to undertake, so I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. It's just interesting listening to the way we've gone about this. I think 5 years into the current administration, we're very aware. Sorry, we're very aware that the key third sector with 230 members, we're not talking to them. It's really hard to understand why we go through a budget process on paper but not engaging fully. Can I understand what engagement we genuinely had with that sector?
So I say there's two things there. One, the savings plan came in very late in the process. We were trying to avoid. So there is a straight kind of process issue there. So talking to them about this specific issue, yep, it came in very late. We wouldn't have wanted it to be like that. That's where we are. The other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, these contracts aren't being managed by us, a lot of them. So actually, they're not our contracts to deal with at the moment. They're coming back in April. So it's been very difficult because they've been outsourced for 10 years. And so, you know, the engagement with the third sector absolutely is key, and I hope that I'm, you know, again, not my direct portfolio area, but I know the cabinet members responsible will absolutely want to much better engage with the third sector once we are back in control of those contracts.
Yeah, I've got a couple of additional points. I think Mark's touched on the kind of the acuteness of the budget gap that does drive some of those more difficult decisions that you put forward, and it is part of that budget setting cycle where, you know, things may feel later. That's because it's really important for us to understand the current financial landscape of running the council. So to set the budget, we've got to understand what's it costing now. So our Q2 forecast gets completed in October, goes to Cabinet in November. That gives a really tight window to understand what's happening now and what's our future year's estimates sound. So you bring it all together to kind of create what's the savings requirement. So the engagement starts as soon as we understand and have agreed a balanced proposal for the budget, which is launching the public consultation in December. But the engagement doesn't stop, like you say, in the process of budget setting. That's going to continue throughout the course of this budget.
Thank you. I'm still bewildered that we know that they've had no inflationary for 10 years, but it's contracted out or not, it's just awareness around it. It just seems strange that we've not got a full handle on where we're at. But anyway, Dina, I totally get your use of wording, overspend, when it's pressure. But actually, as a department, what is being done to actually recognise why those inflationary pressures are on for inflationary of use of service? What things should we be planning for to mitigate that uplift in need for those services?
So some of this is not about this, well, some of it is actually about the service becoming more expensive for a variety of reasons. Some of that is around costs of, say, agency staff, for example, but there will be other costs as well. But there is also a large number, there's an increase in those that are needing that additional provision, whether or not that is an increase in children needing transport, whether or not that's an increase in children who are taken into care, whether, and that may be just a temporary measure, or there might be much more longer term. For some of those, it would be possible to invest in preventative services. And some of that also might be, we might require some additional capital spend, and I know that's a conversation that's going on at the moment. If we had more SEND provision, educational provision locally, then that would be, that would then have an impact on our revenue in terms of transportation, and also, for some children, actually a residential setting would be more appropriate. So again, that's another area where we need to be looking at investment. So it's, and those are just some examples, but it's not necessarily a question of, I don't like the phrase overspend. That can easily be managed in a different way. And of course, there may well be instances where that is the case, but by and large, it is larger. It's larger issues than that.
Thank you, Dina. Chair. One more. Yep. I know there's a big play on how we're benefiting from heritage and from parking, and great, absolutely wonderful that that gives us that. I remember a few years back how we talked about the commercial estate, and that was the golden egg. That seems to have gone off the agenda, even though it's a huge amount of money that is still coming in. It's understanding that we worked that badly. We didn't manage that. I've just wondered that parking charges, excessively trying to grow that. What are the impacts that we are building into the longer term of squeezing those assets?
I think parking charges, we certainly can't keep pushing them up at the rate we've been pushing them up. That's certainly true. If only because it becomes kind of, you reach a stage where the penalties are, you might as well pay the penalties, not the charges. So I think we can't keep pushing those up at the same kind of rate. That's certainly true. But I don't think what we've done so far is unsustainable. You talk about the commercial estate. I haven't mentioned the commercial estate. Actually, the commercial estate is functioning way better than it had been in the past. I mean, I think we've acknowledged some difficulties around management of the commercial estate historically. Those are that situation is much, much better now. Our commercial estate income is pretty healthy. I think we're at 6 or 7% on...
7 on total
assets. About 7 on assets. So which is not, that's pretty good now. The baths, I know that the officers responsible for running the baths have been looking very carefully at charging for that. It's interesting. So they're going to make more money this year than pre-COVID, but with lower visitor numbers. So their take per visitor is going up, which is very good. And that means that they probably have got some room to manoeuvre, because they can then push the visitor numbers back up, probably. I mean, not up to the same kinds of levels, because one of the things that is driving that increased cost per head is a better visitor experience, which means actually fewer people cramming the place in the first place. So it's a difficult balance. But yeah, I mean, I don't think anything we've done at the moment is going to cause us any future problem. I would acknowledge that we're not going to be able to get the same kind of percentage increases out of things like parking year on year. That's true.
Thank you. Malcolm?
Thank you. I get the 3SG stuff has broken late, and you guys will be engaging with them about how to make that work. But can I just ask what assumptions we've made regarding the impact of those 3SG cuts on the statutory services we need to provide, and how we've gone and budgeted for that impact? Is that in hard lines, or is that down as risk, or what have you?
So precisely the reason that we need to engage with the third sector about those cuts is that we don't want to have downstream impact on statutory services. I mean, as a principle, if, as I say, we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot, it would be a stupid thing to do. So we will be looking at value for money from each of those contracts and making decisions based on the value for money that they're providing.
So current assumption is you can make those cuts without there being an increase in our cost to provide these statutory services?
Yeah, we're not planning for those reductions to cause us further problem, financial problem.
Okay, cool. Two more, if I may, quickly. Andy, you went through some stuff in there which was saying that we had between 12.3 and 13.6 million around the risk position, but we talked about the contingency being a £3 million contingency and then a £1 million inflationary contingency. I didn't quite understand how they married up.
Right. I'll explain it in detail, because there are two different elements to the budget. So in my my 151 officer statement, there's two things. That I've done an assessment of risk on the budget proposal, where if costs go up by 20%, or so there's the upside of things go down, demanding costs by 20%. There's around a kind of a £3.6 million tolerance on that. So a contingency has been made in the budget. There's budgeted for of 3 million to allow for risk, because the savings and income proposals are 16.8 million. We've got a good track record of delivering against that, but if you don't deliver 100%, I've got to factor in a risk tolerance. So that's the 3 million that's provided for in the budget. Outside of that, there's the kind of the unknown risk that's not as defined and set in the budget. So that's where there's the risk assessment against all risks. So touching on the kind of the impact on social care, if demand keeps going up in social care and it's above our budget levels, we have done an assessment on that as well. So there's a longer range of different service areas. We've made a risk assessment, and that's got a value attached to it. That's that range for our reserve levels, because that's above budget. So if the council overspends, because all of those risks realise, I've got to do an assessment that we're going to be able to pay for things at the end of the year, and we've got a suitable level of reserve, and that's the 12.6 million of general reserve that we're holding in case those risks materialise in the year.
That does make sense, thank you. One more, if I can, please. I know as a council that our borrowing position per resident compares favourably with lots of other councils, but how does this budget change that position for our residents going forward?
So, so our borrowing levels naturally will start increasing as we do more things. So kind of total borrowing taken out, it moves up and down. So it's hard to really answer, because we'll basically pay for borrowing completely that we've already taken out and then take out new borrowing. So we have like a boundary limit. We are in a good range where we're below our limit throughout the cycle of the budget. So I wouldn't say we're going to appear in the kind of the top list of over borrowed councils. So we're going to remain in probably a healthy level if we start measuring per head of population.
Thank you. Lucy.
Thank you very much, Andrew Mark. I just had a couple of questions on details that I just wanted to be clear on, and just I know there's a good explanation for this, but I just wondered in the budget funding requirements, and I think it's just about moving the base budgets around, but because it stands out as a figure, the 4.63 million, which is a corporate budget adjustment with a contingency, new home bonus and settlement grants. I think that is just moving that sum around, and in terms of the base budget, and just wondered if you could explain that a little bit more. And also the this year, the budget adjustments on which the budget is predicated is 3 million, which is slightly more than in previous years. And I just wondered if it's possible to unpack that figure a bit. And finally, Mark's touched on home to school transport, and that we're making an increasing our provision for that by 1.76 million. But I just wondered, again, how we compare with other authorities on that, and what our plans are, and the pressures that are arising from that.
On the home to school transport, yeah. So the home to school transport, I think when we got some external help looking at home school transport, they highlighted it as an area that was obviously escalating. Internally, we are reviewing all of the packages that we're offering to make sure that they're appropriate. Anecdotally, we've certainly heard that we perhaps don't go back and reassess those offerings, so that it might be that a child needs a particular form of transport to be provided because they need to be transported by themselves, for example, but then over time they perhaps could move to a position where they would be able to use transport joint with others, and that we need to be definitely assessing those kinds of changes through the life of the provision for a particular child. There is also, this is being suffered by all councils, it's not just us. We got that confirmed, I say, through external checks. There is a market failure here. All councils have been making representations to central government about the fact that there is a market failure in home to school transport. I would like to see some help from central government in dealing with that as a national market failure, but I'm not going to hold my breath. But
Thanks, Councillor Hodge. So the 3 million is the corporate contingency line that I mentioned earlier, where I've done the risk assessment around our general risk profile, because the level of savings we need to achieve are higher, so the risk is higher. So that's where we provided a 3 million contingency. I think last year's budget was 1 million. Then we've got to reflect, in year the council is you're currently in an above budget position, so there are risks definitely, but that's reflected by having a higher level of corporate contingency. Your first question was on, you said 4.6 million. I'm just struggling to see that line in the papers. So.
Is that in Annex 2?
Yeah, is that in the annex? Okay, I can get that broken down for you. It'll be our capital financing, new homes bonus, grant adjustments. Within that, there's probably a list of things. So I can share a breakdown of that with the panel.
I just thought I'd flag it up in case for people listening if it stood out, but it's just an adjustment, I'm sure, in those.
Yeah, it's where we hold corporate budgets for kind of the general financing of all of the council services. So I'll be able to provide a breakdown to the panel for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Toby?
Thank you. I'd like to look at the discussion on page 10 or 14 of the pack about the dedicated schools grant and the high needs block in particular. it seems to me that we're overspending the high needs block at about the rate of 8 million a year. And although it's not a charge on general fund at the moment, is it a risk to the general fund? Are we confident that DFE are going to be able to tackle this problem? And am I right in thinking it is of that order?
You're right to raise it as a risk. At the moment, it's not a risk to the Council's general funds because there's a statutory override in place that means, in terms of accounting, it's not a cost that falls directly on the general fund, so it's held outside of that. If that changes, it would become a risk because if that deficit needs to be fully funded, it would be an impact on Council reserves. So when we discuss this with our auditor, at the moment our reserve levels are suitable to manage that risk, but that would mean taking money away from other areas of the council that has commitments against them because it makes it a general fund risk. But at the moment it's held outside, so it's not a risk.
Just if I can comment there as well, I mean, again, that's a much bigger problem in some other councils, and I've seen some very high numbers reported in the deficit on the schools grant, which Andy said is at the moment with us as a statutory override, and they don't have to include it in their, as a risk against their general fund. I think politically there isn't a situation where the government suddenly decide that they're going to make all councils realise that risk, because they would put a lot of councils into a very difficult position. So whilst that statutory override exists, it's not a problem, and I don't see them removing the statutory override without having to provide some kind of mitigation.
One other risk I'd just like to flag up, because my old authority is being bankrupted by it, is putting homeless people in hotels with difficulty about private rented sector evictions and the failure to tackle Section 21. Are we confident we've got a reasonably robust estimate of the homelessness costs for the coming year?
Those are going up. Those have gone up dramatically, absolutely. I was in a meeting this afternoon just before this one talking about our efforts to very quickly increase the council's owned provision rather than putting people in hotels. It's better for them, it's better for us. So we are moving swiftly to try and bring some properties back into use for our own homelessness provision. I'm sure details of that will become public in time, but yeah, that's definitely a risk. It's identified, and yes, we are actively doing things to resolve it.
Thank you. I think all other panel members have had the opportunity for questions and comments, so just make a couple of comments and contributions myself. I'm sure that people have heard me mention on any number of occasions in previous years that my belief that we should have a department for unforeseen consequences, that actions that are taken and budget decisions that are taken have consequences down the line, down the pipeline that we don't see. And I have to say a very clear example of that personally this year is third sector funding, but I'll come back to that in some detail in a minute. In a sense, this is trying to, as well as my questions, it's summarising the themes that have come out from the questions and the contributions from other panel members. We kind of are where we are because of decisions taken in central government, although I think one particular decision that hasn't been taken, of course, is implementation of the Dilnot report going back to 2011, which identified nearly 13 years ago, that the adult social care system was broken. And, of course, central government hasn't done anything about that since. So, again, context. One of my concerns, and I expressed it at the Children and Young People's panel, was the lack of detail on children and adults' social care I appreciate there's more detail in the paper now with the risk assessments and the equality impact assessments, but it is the one area that gives, I should imagine, 151 officers more sleepless nights than others, and that's not just here but across the country. The amount of detail for Dina's panel was very limited. And I suppose my questions to Andy and yourself, Mark, is how confident are you that we won't see the situation of first and second quarter big overspends on those two areas? And I think Lucy highlighted one particular area, and that is in home-to-school transport. I don't think it's any particular secret that the Labour group will be highlighting home-to-school transport when it comes to our amendments and suggestions to Council. I know that there's work been done by the LGA, but in talking to officers, I haven't been overly confident that that has actually been picked up locally in a way that it should be. Colin highlighted the commercial estate. I'm glad to see that you think it's way better. The description you use is way better, Mark. I'd have to say, having been a councillor on Baines for over 12 years now, that's coming from a very low bar. So it's a piece of work that has been emphasised by panel members, that we want to drill down into commercial estate and the workings. I have to say, it's good to hear that we're looking at 6 to 7% return on assets. Part of my concern, though, and this was a briefing last week, is that officers appear to divide what Baines actually owns into assets that can generate money and a lot bigger chunk of assets that can't. And that's something we're going to be looking at. The fact that, for example, that Baines owns mines was news to me last week. That's a piece of work that as a scrutiny panel we'll be doing, and I think that's a line that will come in our summary to Cabinet and to Council as well. So if you want to come back to me on that, yeah?
Just respond briefly on that. I mean, we actively chose to divide the portfolio into commercial estate and corporate estate. It's not that corporate estate can't make money, it's that its primary aim is to provide facilities to the council and services to residents. The commercial estate, the primary aim is to provide revenue, and so I mean that's an intentional division.
And Andy,
well, I was just going to add that is a requirement for our statement of accounts as well in terms of differentiating the type of asset. We've got assets held for investment, so the investment estate is the commercial estate, and then we have the operational assets held for operational use for the council. So we do differentiate in that way for our council. So
yes, and I think separating that corporate and commercial estate is, yes, something I think all panel members would agree with. I suppose part of our concern is that there's, in the past, when this panel has looked at scrutinising individual decisions on the commercial estate, not only has information been opaque, but councillors have been excluded from those discussions if they're not members of this panel. So I have to say that past conduct doesn't give confidence to future performance, and it's something we'll chase up, and I'm sure that the Cabinet will be happy that we'll be doing so. Just flagging that there. A question from me as well is there, and again it's difficult. The amount of information we have, in particular on pressure areas and where cuts are being made. I'd personally like to see more information on the use of agency staff, and I do appreciate that has to be done at some points in time, but also the use of consultants. It came up at a previous panel that consultants are used. And how much is that? And see some of the work on appreciating it's necessary on a spend-to-save basis, but it's something I think more information would be useful on.
Sure. I think, the two main areas we've used consultants recently have been around council structure, where we need external expertise to help us. And I think it's perfectly reasonable then to use that. And on around the budget challenge process, specifically about getting an external view so that we, from organisations that have an experience around the country, so that we can learn from best practice. And I think that, again, that's something we cannot provide for ourselves internally. I completely agree that we shouldn't be using external consultants for things that we can do ourselves, and we are not doing that.
Certainly not arguing with... I'm always slightly concerned when you hear statements that no consultants will be used from some councils, because I'd agree that in some circumstances it is necessary. The two examples you've used, does that include the consultancy work that Councillor Paul May outlined on Pricewaterhouse on children and young people?
It wasn't Pricewaterhouse, I think it was EY, but yes.
Fine. Oh, EY, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Fine, thank you. Also, it's good to hear the highlight on supporting people who are homeless, bringing council provision in so that we can provide that ourselves. Again, something I'd personally support, and I'm sure the panel members would do. But if we are increasing the number of council habitations, and I use that phraseology because it's in the 88 Acts, I think we should see something in budget lines about a housing revenue account, because of course 199 habitations are the point at which over that you have to have an HRA.
I'm no expert in an HRA, and I don't pretend to be, but I know that we are, that is something that we absolutely are closely monitoring and planning for the point at which we will require an HRA. So, I say, it would be better to get one of my councillor colleagues to come and talk to you about that, who would understand it better, because it's a complicated and detailed area. But I know it is something that is being closely examined.
I appreciate that complicated doesn't do HRA justice in terms of what it is to introduce. It's more that highlighting that as a piece of work that's going on, I think would reassure those of us who support the principle of bringing council.
I'm very happy to reassure you that work is going on. If you want any more detail, I'll get somebody else to talk to you about it.
Thank you very much. Have to mention as well that, and I suppose this is parochial very much in the sense that I live in Radstock and represent Westfield, that the proposals to put parking charges in Radstock and Midsummer Norton, I would argue that very firmly comes under the Department of Unforeseen Consequences, because the potential consequence to footfall to businesses is something that should not be underestimated. I do appreciate that this proposal came forward as one of the consequences of Michael Gove's early Christmas present, but I would strongly personally suggest that needs to be rowed back from, as the consequences could be extremely difficult for both those towns and the businesses in both those towns. And coming last but certainly not least, just want to make a few comments about the third sector grants. And I suppose it is a declaration of interest that I chair Radstock and Westfield Community Interest Company, which is administering the £1 million that has come from the lottery over 10 years. And the reason I say that is because one of the reasons that that money came in from the lottery to Radstock and Westfield was that the heat maps that lottery were doing was showing that there was an under-application for grants by voluntary sector organisations, and that that was something that they were trying to redress. My experience certainly is that that Baines has historically, less so now, but historically has underfunded infrastructure support for the third sector, and that has certainly improved since COVID. But I don't think we should underestimate how important that sector is, not only with the services that they deliver, but the money that they bring in from other sources into Bath and North East Somerset. I think very clearly we've heard details in the past of major grant awards that have come in for heritage services from the lottery, for Fashion Museum and the rest. And I'd actually separate out, for want of a better way of putting it, wholesale and retail. Those big applications have been good and have given the impression of a lot of money coming into Bath and North East Somerset, but I personally think it has masked the lack of small bits and pieces. You know, being a Yorkshireman, many a mickle makes a muckle. It's the 10,000, the 20,000, the 5,000, the 50,000 grants that we've been missing out of, the millions we've been getting, and all credit to those those areas where that money has come in. And I would certainly, I mean, I appreciate that this is taking over funding that was before was Virgin and was outsourced. But I suppose, asking you a direct question, Andy, can capital money be used in order to smooth out that potential cut over 4 years, so that the consequences and the implications of that can be seen not only in terms of service delivery and potential upstream effects, but also the potential for leverage? It would be a shame to lose to save £800,000 on a budget when potentially using a leverage of £6 to £1, you're losing £5 million is penny-wise, pound-foolish. So if I've come to you before I make another comment.
Yeah, we can't directly apply capital to our revenue budget. It is one that, as Councillor Elliott's committed to take away and consider based on the conversation today and for the additional feedback we've had through the consultation process.
Okay, thank you. I'll come on again. I've got a form of words, hopefully, that as a panel we can agree, but I'll come back to that in a minute ago. Can also, have we had any details yet? Are we getting any indications of the rise in precept from parish and town councils? The reason I ask that is and again, declaration of interest being a parish clerk, that the 5% or the 4.99% rule doesn't apply to parishes and towns. I'm aware that some parishes and towns are looking at picking up services that are no longer being provided, or not provided in the way that's wanted by Baines. And I think looking over the border into Somerset, I'm aware that some towns are putting precepts up by 10, 20, 30%, just simply because Somerset are on the point of going bust. And that has a consequence, because in Bath you might be talking about putting the mayoralty up by 50p or something, by a few pence. But for areas of deprivation out, particularly in North East Somerset, that is a substantial rise and is adding to the amount of support that we need to give and food banks that parishes and towns are doing. So I don't know if you're aware, I'm just highlighting this as a possible unforeseen consequence.
I'm not able to answer the detail because we don't have that information yet. It comes into the finance team following the town and parish councils' individual meetings on the budget, and that information will come from their clerks. It will be in the council tax resolution documents that will be publicised as part of the full budget pack for council.
Thank you. Those are my questions and personal points that I'm making as a panel member. I think looking around is moving on to what, as a panel, we want to be saying, or you want me to be saying to Cabinet and to Council. The first thing I've got is to say that as a panel we recognise the difficult financial circumstances that the Council finds itself in, and thank officers in particular for the work they've done in order to come to what is a difficult set of proposals, but a necessary set of proposals in order to balance a budget. Secondly, on the third sector, can we urge a fuller examination of the consequences of cuts to the third sector, with an extension to the current short timescale being a priority, into having a full assessment of consequences and a full assessment of outcomes to that? Kind of look around, and that appears to be fine. There was a comment, and it was Lucy and myself were asking questions about the home-to-school transport, and can we ensure that there is a full examination of the current home-to-school transport budget and potential savings efficiencies for future years. On the commercial estate, can this panel will remind Cabinet and Council that as a panel we are looking to have a full scrutiny of the commercial estate, that we look forward to that being reflected in an examination by Cabinet, and that, first of all, that scrutiny should be a full public scrutiny, which hasn't happened in the past, but also it would be useful to see some kind of appropriate benchmarking of income from the commercial estate. The example that I've used in the past has been St John's Foundation, which is kind of looks as a parallel. I'm looking around to panel members. Is that okay? Any other additions, Colin?
I just really want to see how we revisit this whole introduction of a parking charge in Midsummer Norton. I think the consequences and what modelling, to hear a Cabinet member fairly recently saying they'd done no transport modelling while they tried to push forward with an LTN, shows a real lack of judgment as to impact. And I think parking charges, as employers in that area will find, gaining people to come and work for companies is not just about the shops, and I'm not sure we're fully appreciating the impacts that introduction for a short-term gain might have.
Okay. Are other panel members happy with that? I'm aware that this is a party political issue as much as it is a scrutiny issue, and I don't want to to politicise. But are we asking for a re-exam? Are we happy to ask for a re-examination? I'm taking that silence is golden in this point. I'm sure that will come up. Any other points that you want me to raise with Cabinet and then with Council? If not, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Andy, for coming along. Thank you for fielding some interesting and questions. Thank you for panel members for the contribution to that discussion. I'm suggesting about a 60-second, 2-minute delay before the next agenda item, so you can make your excuses and leave, as they say in the.
Thanks, everyone.
In whatever. Thank you. Sorry, rather than me repeat.
In regards to the recommendation around the parking proposal, what I think as a panel we could do is invite the Cabinet member to come back to the Climate Emergency Sustainability panel once that re-evaluation is taken with a plan to in terms of deliverability of that proposal. So just building on what's been said. At an appropriate panel when the Cabinet member is ready to come to report to us.
I think the comment about it needs to be re-examined is something that goes into the budget process. The detail of how that should be is useful, as it clearly shows that we, the officers, have looked at that. I think there's going to be a number of the suggestions. The third sector is one as well, in particular, that will form part of the budget discussion, but we'll want to be pulling that back, and certainly the children and young people will want to be pulling that, because there are consequences. And I certainly didn't get the impression from Mark that there would be any pushback against re-examining third sector funding. It certainly didn't give the impression that it's something, and I know there's many things he doesn't want to do, but that's that and the parking charges are, I think, two areas where very clearly Andy, as the 151 officer, is saying you might not think this is a good idea, but you're going to have to give me a balanced budget, and that'll be his question to us as a council in February. Is that kind of clear? It's never that clear cut when it comes to this time of year in a budget. And if you think this is fun, you should see it when there's a hung council. So, yeah. Looking at the agenda, the next bit is the work plan. I'm sorry, flicking back. Is the panel's work plan. We did discuss that last week. I'd say one thing that came up that we were discussing just before this meeting, and something that Hal was raising just before the meeting, was the whole issue of scrutiny of the commercial estate. And I think we're probably going to have to be a bit more clarity in what we want to see from the commercial estate. I think the overview was useful last week, but it probably raises as many questions as it gives us answers. And I do think I was surprised with Andy's comment about 6 to 7% is going to be the return from the commercial estate. I think that's 6 to 7% from a selected part of the commercial estate, and I think there are other parts of the commercial estate that aren't being included in that, because I don't think that's possible from some of the stuff that we've got.
Just like as part of that, they glossed over it so quickly, but the R&M type budget to maintain or bring some of those properties into a serviceable condition, where is that 6 million that he talked about actually coming off? Yeah. Because that is, that's revenue being spent, but are they hiding it in capital? You know, I just feel we need to scrutinise that to go, that 16 odd million headline figure, we're doing great, but hang on a minute, is that inclusive? It's like a little bit of the aqueous figures telling us that they're giving us $1 million when they're actually not, because we're actually paying interest on that money that they've borrowed. So they're not giving us $1 million a year, they're giving us a lot less than that. So it's that sort of detail that we need to scrutinise to genuinely get a proper picture of that return, because 6-7% sounds okay. Yeah. But if you're actually spending repeatedly 6 million on maintaining it, that's coming off that figure, then that figure isn't quite correct. Yeah.
They did make a distinction between commercial and non-commercial, and I would have thought that we would have separate investigations of that to go into enough depth.
Well, part of that is this building is a good example. It does generate revenue, but it's regarded as part of the corporate estate. So I think we all should get clarity on that, and what part of the corporate estate does actually still make us money.
And I think
also a kind of, sorry, but there was a sort of a statement that we had too much for our size. I didn't have a problem with that.
Yeah, and be they mines or whatever, if they're assets, what are we actually doing to make sure those assets are being utilised? It's great to have as many as possible.
But not necessarily if some of those assets which could be generating money are actually costing money and are not appearing in the slice of the pie, if you like, that's saying these are the income generating properties that we have. I think Aquis is probably the best example of sleight of hand when it comes to income. We're being told we're getting £1 million from Aquis, but that £1 million has to pay for interest on money that we've given to Aquis. So smoke and mirrors to a degree.
And so what I think the question I asked them last week was to try and understand from an income budget point of view how much money Baines are giving them for consultancy work and other things. We touched on consultants. I know Aquis have had over £1 million in the last financial year. Well, if that was property services internally, are we getting value? Where is that money being spent? And that's, I've got lots of line items I can see, but I'd like to see how they're actually spent and why that is inflated to such a figure now.
Yeah. Thank you. So if it can be a priority to thank the property services for coming along, and we enjoyed it so much, we wanted them to come back sooner. 12th of March, please, yeah. It would be useful to have officers here so we can talk through the questions we have and hear how they're going to answer those or not, as past history, and start that discussion.
With paperwork?
Yes. Yeah, agreed. We'll see how that discussion goes, but I think that's positive. Looking at the clock, it is coming up to just after 6:15. I think people know my views on meetings going on over 2 hours. So as we're just under 2 hours, are there any other issues on panel work plan?
Sorry, I just had one inquiry. The performance indicators session that we've got, is that on the all the corporate? Is it just reporting back a resident survey, or is it looking at the corporate reporting framework? I think we discussed that possibly. That yes, I think it was.
Yeah, we fed through to the officers the request for an update on the feedback from Voicebox, the public survey, but also an overview of the integrated reporting framework, so you can see how all the performance indicators knit through to that cabinet report that is used for performance monitoring.
I think last time we saw the performance indicators, it all had a very positive spin on it, and I think we were very much interested in some of the indicators which perhaps weren't going so well, and the sort of actions which have been taken to go and resolve those and bring those things back up. And that was a message we made last time. I think I don't know if it's hit, and if that's the sort of report we'll be getting in March.
Yeah, thank you. Point well made.
Sorry, Robin, can I just clarify? I appreciate what you said about commercial and corporate estates, but have we put anything in for Aquis in terms of scrutinising tendering process? I think we need to give them a heads up and a date timeline to actually come back and talk to us about how they tender and allow us to actually see some of those tender processes, because the figures they were coming up with were unimaginable.
Can we include that as well, please? Okay. Looking around. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for contributions. I think it was an interesting and informative meeting, and see you all at Cabinet and then Council, and to continue the discussions.